sitting here in Los Angeles, we're really located in a city that serves as the gateway to the Pacific Rim and to the world. UCLA Anderson needs to have a strong and visible presence in Latin America, and we really need to be deeply engaged in the region, which today's conference really emphasizes that we are. As Executive Director of UCLA Anderson's Center for Global Management, I have the pleasure and privilege to work with our many student leaders here to put on and host today's conference, including student leaders from the Latin American Business Association and also this year's first partnership and collaboration with the Undergraduate Student Association, known as the Latino Business Student Association, who have worked very, very hard to bring today's conference to life. So thanks to each and every one of them for their energy, passion, and commitment and drive in helping to manage and organize today's event. Today's conference is really a forum for broad discussion around a variety of topics. For those of you who were here this morning, we had a great panel discussion looking at the relationship between Los Angeles and Latin America. And this afternoon, we'll have panel discussions looking at the changing media and entertainment landscape. We'll also be looking at the importance of innovation and technology to Latin America's economic growth, and the opening up of Latin America, and the importance of global cooperation and intra-regional trade to the region's future. I'd also like to take this opportunity to personally thank our partner in today's conference, the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, and also recognize our speakers for our sponsors for today's conference, City National Bank, UPS, the Port of Los Angeles, UCLA's Latin American Institute, and our Center for Media and Entertainment. So thanks each and every one of you. It's now my great honor and privilege to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Mr. Bryan Stockton. Bryan served as the chairman and chief executive officer of Mattel, the worldwide leader in design, manufacture, and marketing of toys, up until January 2015. Prior to being named Mattel's sixth CEO, in early 2012, he served as the company's chief operating officer and was responsible for the company's sales and operations, which included Mattel Brands, Fisher-Price, American Girl, and Mattel International, as well as worldwide operations and the corporate responsibility divisions. He was previously president of the $3 billion Mattel International, having led and grown Mattel's international operations over the prior 7 years. Bryan has also held a variety of senior leadership roles, including serving as a member of the board of the Mattel's Children's Hospital here at UCLA for 9 years. He was the chairman of the World Trade Week Southern California, and also served on the board of directors of the 2015 Special Olympic World Summer Games here in Los Angeles. And at UCLA Anderson, we're honored to have Bryan as an invaluable member of our Board of Visitors, and he also co-chairs the board's Strategic Initiatives Committee, tasked to provide the Board of Visitors really with input into UCLA Anderson's next 5-year strategic plan. So we couldn't be more pleased to have Bryan join us here today to keynote our conference. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bryan Stockton.
Muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes. Obrigado. Boa tarde, y ahora en inglés, por favor. ¿Sí? Gracias. That's as good as my Spanish is going to get this afternoon. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon. But I want you to imagine this. In Brazil, China is investing heavily in infrastructure to access natural resources. In Argentina, portfolio investment from the United States is driving up the cost of real estate and services, while inflation, because of a fixed exchange rate, is rampant. In Venezuela, oil revenue is sky high thanks to uncertainty and war in the Middle East, and demand for oil is unprecedented worldwide. And then suddenly, all that changes, all of it disappears. We know that these are the ingredients of an economic disaster. But I'm not talking about what's happening today in Latin America. I'm talking about what happened in 1998 and 1999. Well, what happened back then? What did we learn? And what are the parallels that we can have to today's time and today's problems? These lessons may help us navigate what continues to be an intriguing and uncertain, but certainly a world in Latin America with lots of potential. Now, I always find this kind of event very interesting. We have in the audience a whole host of kinds of people. We have decision makers in the financial and investment community, business leaders, we have entrepreneurs, and of course, future leaders and very bright people, because I see a lot of students in the audience, and the students really excite me. I want to thank you for being here this afternoon, and I especially want to thank Dean Judy Olian for inviting me here, and Lucy and her team that's made this so tremendous. And I also want to thank also the sponsors and the student groups that have coalesced around this to make this a fantastic meeting. So thank you very much. I want to share with you the ups and downs and the ups again of Latin America this afternoon. So first, let me offer just a quick bit of history, and forgive me because I am going to simplify things just a bit, because I really do want to get to the good news as quickly as I can. About 20 years ago, and this is in the mid-1990s, Brazil and Argentina were booming. Chinese and American investment was quite strong. Chinese investment in particular was driving much of the growth in Brazil. Then in 1997, we saw the beginnings of the Asian financial crisis, which caused a slowdown in investment from China. The Brazilian economy took a turn for a mild recession, but a combination of factors, one being the fact that exports were nearly 40% of GDP at the time, another being the government spending on public programs, which are always hard to spool up and even more difficult to unravel, were exploding. The costs were going out of control. This combination of factors caused leaders in Brazil to seek a fast cure by trying to increase interest rates while simultaneously cutting spending and increasing taxes. Well, when this didn't work, the government decided to try floating the Brazilian real on the open market against the US dollar, and it met with disastrous results. Within just a few months, the value of the real had dropped by almost 35%. This economic crisis in Brazil rippled outwards towards the region. Argentina, which heavily depended on trade and secondary investment from Brazil, had already begun slipping into recession in the mid-1990s. That's because portfolio investment from the U.S. started drying up, and Argentina began relying very heavily on the IMF. The Brazilian crisis compounded the challenges in Argentina, and as a result, Argentina then entered one of its darkest economic periods, known as the Great Argentine Depression, in 1998. Now, during this dark period in Argentina, the economy shrank 28%, and more than half of the country was considered impoverished. 1/4 of the country became indigent, and 70% of children were living below the poverty level. It was a catastrophe that didn't start to fix itself until the early 2000s. Wow, that's a story. But it was about at that point in 2003, I was appointed the head of Mattel International Operations. And the reason I'm giving you this little bit of history is I want to provide some context for what I was facing when I took that job on. When I was appointed to that position, I was very excited about the opportunity to grow the entire international business, but the Latin American business in particular. I believe there is tremendous potential to accelerate growth and profitability in that region. I believe there is the ability to create scale so the Latin American region could be as independent and successful as the United States and Europe. I knew, for example, that the affinity for brands, Western brands in particular, would facilitate faster adaptation of Mattel's great brands in those countries. I also believed that we needed to be ready for the next uptick and upswing in the economic boom that was going to be coming back to the business cycle in Latin America. There was, however, one catch. When I was told I was getting the job, my boss said, and I quote, and Corinne's in the audience, so she's heard this story before, so she'll say it's true. He said, and I quote, "I know that you're the only one strong enough to close Brazil." Now imagine that. That's my first job. Go to Brazil and close it. Well, why would my boss say that about Brazil? Well, at the time, for every $1 in toy sales revenue we were generating $2 of profit loss. That's a pretty bleak picture. Well, with my boss wanting me to close Brazil, and that ran counter to my desire to create success in Brazil as well across Latin America. This appointment could have turned into a career-ending opportunity for me. But I was actually quite confident that we could develop a strategy to create success not just in Brazil, but across all of Latin America. So you can imagine the strategic understanding, the strategic planning that we needed to develop to convince my boss that we had a better and alternative strategy. Well, we did this by first setting out to turn the business around. And we developed very clear strategies for each country based on understanding what makes that country tick, and just as importantly, what doesn't tick in that country. And I'll get to some examples of that in a few minutes. We focused specifically on in-country execution, adapting our brands as quickly as we could across the region, simplifying and focusing the product lines that we chose to sell, and importantly, recruiting and retaining the very best talent in Latin America. And we executed all this in a very dynamic environment, an ever-changing consumer environment, trade environment, and most challenging, a changing regulatory environment. Today, just like I experienced over 10 years ago, there is still a lot of opportunity in Latin America. And I hope you take that away from this discussion today and the entire program. But just like then, there are bright spots today and there are not so bright spots in the marketplace. There are also substantial foreign investments in place, and there are decisions to be made about these investments, such as, what are we going to do? Do we stay in? Do we go out? There are also decisions to be made about future investments. Do we want to continue to invest in Latin America? And these decisions will be made in the context of political instability, but also the desire to try to have the economies evolve from commodity-based economies to a more balanced structure in their economic environment. Now recall, it was really not that long ago that everyone was talking about BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Some people called them BRICS, plural to include South Africa. And everyone talked about the unlimited growth that would never stop. Well, what happened? Well, the Great Recession in 2009, 2012 certainly took a toll worldwide. U.S. investment in many of these countries disappeared, and just like in that 1979 to 1999 period, the ripple effects went outward. But I think if we can understand the history of what happened and what is happening now, we can navigate our way through the waters today and choppy waters potentially in the future. So in order to be successful in Latin America, and I want you to believe it is truly possible to have a sustainable success in Latin America, I want you to remember what I just said earlier. It's possible, but you have to really think hard about what you're going to do. So I was sent to Brazil with the expectations of closing operations. We didn't do that. Well, what happened? Well, we wound up growing our sales in Brazil by a factor of 5. We wound up gaining scale in Brazil. We improved the profitability. We created the largest consumer products license business for Mattel in Brazil. And ultimately, Brazil became one of the top countries for Mattel in terms of size, profitability, and growth. It was a true star performer in our portfolio. So, as you think about what happened and what we were able to accomplish all across Latin America, what does it take to be successful? I think one of the things we might want to start thinking about is we should stop calling things Latin American. Latin America is not a monolithic entity. We need to think of it as a collection of very unique countries. I think the term Latin America is very handy if you're an accountant. It's a nice, convenient way to take everything south of the Rio Grande and west of the Azores and put it in a nice geographic region called Latin America. But if you think about North America, where we are all living at the moment, North America is really a collection of hundreds of different communities, different regions, different economies, different cultures. So we are a collection of different people and different things, and so too is Latin America. So I encourage you to think about it like that. So I call Latin America a geographic region. I do not call it the name of a strategy or an approach to business. So let's think about what this collection of individual pieces is all about. Well, now, obviously, aside from language differences, yes, there's Spanish and there's Portuguese and there's all the local and regional dialects of those languages, but every country, every federal state or province in those countries, sometimes even cities, suburbs, villages, had their own cultures, they had their own history, they had their own resources, their own customs, and they had their own laws in many cases that govern how you do business, and you need to understand the economic and regulatory impact of that. Now, as a consumer products person, it was my job to understand these differences and make sure that we were selling toys at the right place at the right time. And this meant really learning to contend with a number of things. First of all, we had to contend with trade barriers and trade agreements. That led to trying to figure out how do you manage the supply chain. Then you had to understand what makes people tick, not just kids tick in terms of whether they like toys, but you have to get their mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and other family members excited about why they should buy a Mattel product. So for example, in Brazil, we learned a very valuable lesson about the die-cast car business and our Hot Wheels brand in particular. Now, if you're from Brazil or you know anything about Brazil, you know that Brazil has a history of producing some of the world's greatest race car drivers of all time. You have Ayrton Senna, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Nelson Piquet, for example. So as a result, Brazilian boys are car crazy and they are racing crazy as well. So once we achieved agreement on how we wanted to reinvest into the die-cast car business and the Hot Wheels brand specifically, we tapped into insights like this to create growth. And as a result, because of these insights and investments, Brazil as a country became the second largest die-cast market in the world for the toy industry, and it became the #2 market for Mattel's Hot Wheel brand. But it's all about really understanding the culture of the country and executing against that. Now, I'm going to mention some challenges with trade barriers in a few minutes, but think about this. This success on the Hot Wheels brand came despite duties and taxes that caused the retail price of a Hot Wheels in Brazil to be 3.5 to 4 times the U.S. price of $1 per car. Now, can you imagine going down the street to a Target or Walmart and paying $3.50 or $4 for a Hot Wheels car here in the United States? Most people can't. The great news is, in Brazil, millions of people could. And that really made us happy, and it made the brand a huge success because we created the value that made that a wonderful, wonderful success story. So obviously, being a part of Mattel, I was focused on how we become a success in toys and games, but I also had to learn a few other things about these countries in general, and particularly the business structure. Distribution channels in this geography are very different than they are in the U.S., and they are very different as you go across the regions. For example, because many consumers in these countries can't qualify for credit through a credit card, oftentimes they will use in-store credit offered by the retailers. Now, when you think about it, that's really no different than what retailers were doing in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s, because credit cards were really not something we used that much. So it's going back to what we used to do here, but it's a very important thing. What was the implication for us? Well, in the United States and other developed countries, you're used to selling toys at hypermarkets or toy specialists. What we learned is there were new channels of distribution open to us. So we actually were able to start selling toys in, of all places, furniture stores because they offered credit. So the lesson here is you really need to be flexible in terms of how you think about your strategy. There's also differences in distribution channels across countries. So for example, in Mexico, if you think about consumer products, the hypermarket formats are really the most popular and the biggest part of the distribution channel. Stores like Gigante, Soriano, and Walmart. Very, very well developed. On the other hand, if you go to Chile, department stores are really the core of the distribution network. Stores like Almacenes, Paris, Ripley, and Falabella are very, very important. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those stores, they sort of look like a Macy's or a Dillard's here in the U.S. So again, you have to be very, very fluid in how you execute your strategies for distribution. They are very different across the countries. Now here's another one I hope you'll find interesting. In the U.S., there are many, many products that are sold at popular prices, and they're very, very successful. However, when you translate these products into Latin America, they become a lot less successful. Well, we started to dig into what happened and why. And the short of it is, as you looked at our earlier brand rebuilding efforts in the Latin American region, our toys were targeted primarily to higher socioeconomic levels of consumers. And the reason was simple. We were essentially taking toys that had been developed for more highly developed economies like the US or Western Europe, for example, and trying to sell them in Latin America. And you can imagine that a toy that's at a popular price here in the US is a premium price in many countries. And so it was limiting the number of people that were able to buy these toys. So we had a challenge. So what did we end up doing? Well, one of the challenges was that no single country had the scale for us to develop a unique product. Not only did none of the countries have enough scale, the entire Latin American region didn't have enough scale for us to create a unique product for that region. So what we wound up doing to try to unlock more revenue growth was to create toys and licensed consumer products that were consistent with the brand but had an eye towards lower costs, which would then translate into lower and more attractive retail prices for the middle class. So branded and licensed consumer products like Barbie stationery, for example, were very, very highly desired for consumers in this region. Why Barbie stationery? Why would that work? Well, it enables a child to interact with the brand at a much more affordable price point than, say, a Barbie doll or another Barbie branded product. We also modified some of our core toys by having just enough features in those toys. Maybe not everything that you would see in the US, or maybe take some of the accessories out to try to lower the price point. In doing this, though, and I want to caution anyone who's thinking about this, you cannot take away the core value of the brand, or in this case, the core value of the play pattern or the magic. We are very careful not to do that. So if you think about this, the next time you're in a hypermarket or a specialty store or department store somewhere in the Latin American region, walk up and down the aisles and you'll be able to find other examples of consumer product brands you may see here in the US that have done a similar strategy outside the US. So now that we're talking about today, let's get back to what's happening right now. Well, in the 15 years or so since Brazil and Argentina recovered, and that's basically the period of 2000 through 2014, most of the countries in Latin America grew. And China began investing heavily in natural resources and infrastructure. And from the US, portfolio investment drove up prices for real estate and services. And oil was booming. And it looks like this is all slowing down and reversing once again. So I think the key question in the minds of many is this: how does this downturn or repeat of history in Latin America, how is this different from what happened before, and what should I do about it now? Now, first, it's true that right now, countries that make up a large proportion of the population, the economy in the region, are suffering economically. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, even Puerto Rico are all suffering greatly. These are countries where the economic and the political environment need lots of changes, the social problems run deep, and without some kind of social and economic reform, there is a real chance for a three-peat of history to occur in the future. So we need to see important changes there. Brazil, you can read about it in the last 2 days. It's really a struggle. Right now, its exports are back up to 35% of GDP, almost where they were in 1998. Only one IPO occurred in 2015, none so far this year. The last time that happened was back in the Great Recession in 2009. And as I'm sure you read yesterday, the Brazilian economy declined another almost 3.5%. So it's a very, very challenging time there. Well, what else is a challenge? And I'm sort of picking on Brazil this afternoon, but what else is challenging? Just doing business in Brazil is a challenge, particularly regarding taxes and regulations. For example, according to The Economist and PricewaterhouseCoopers, the average manufacturing firm there spends 2,600 hours a year preparing taxes. That's the equivalent of 320 working days. Now, the average in other Latin American countries is 356 hours. So it's still a lot less. It sounds like more. In the United States, it's 175 hours. That still sounds like a lot to me, but it's still about 15 times less than in Brazil. So you can imagine the complications. So there are countries that have big problems, but there's a good chance, I think, that they're going to recover more quickly. These countries include places like Panama, Colombia, and Mexico. In Mexico, for example, the peso dropped more than 30% against the dollar, and the government has taken some very measured steps to try to protect that currency, and they seem to be working. Still, though, in Mexico, we continue to read about corruption and mismanagement, and unfortunately, it still struggles with security, especially as drug-related violence continues to grow. So we'll have to wait and see, but I am personally still very bullish on the future of Mexico. And then there are countries whose conditions and challenges are about the same as other parts of the developed world, countries like Peru and Chile. Chile has an especially strong economy and a very good rule of law. We all know that Chile was for a while a case study in Chicago school economics. Regardless of how you may feel about Milton Friedman politically, the reforms that were instituted in Chile as a result of those economic experiments of the 80s and 90s have left Chile very stable and much more lucrative and sustainable than its neighbors. So I've given you many reasons to be cautious. And there are still more. First, the slow speed of reform means businesses will continue to face huge challenges. They must be very thoughtful about investments that they're making in Latin America, even occasionally pausing investments in capital spending or expenses at the expense of time to make sure that these investments are reasonable, stable, and have a good chance of succeeding. That means there's really significant potential for downward pressure on earnings, particularly for companies that have an investment in those countries. Second, inflation is tough on consumers, and it's rampant in Latin America. That means pricing, margins, product availability. They're all impacted by inflation. And the effect can mean tremendous losses also from a business standpoint on equity value, spiking cost to import goods, and a general sense of caution and delay when it comes to either planning your long-term strategy or executing things in the short term. And then third is commodity prices. In a region that's rich with natural resources, as commodity prices go up and they go down, so too the economies of these countries that depend far too much on commodities revenues to balance budgets with gigantic entitlement bills and social programs. Well, with a bleak economic outlook, how could anybody have a positive outlook for Latin America? Well, I have a positive outlook on Latin America, and I'll explain why. For me, I think there's a very unique way of looking at it, and it's not a geographic thing. It really starts with the cultural values that I personally experienced in the countries of Latin America that I've visited. These are the values that really drive the engine of change and prosperity in a country, and I think they're filled with them. For example, the importance of family, and not just immediate family, but the broad sense of family is really crucially important in Latin America. Family formation is what drives consumption. And consumption is what helps to shift a country from a commodity-focused economy to a more balanced structure in how they create their GDP. I also have to mention another very admirable spirit in Latin America, and that is a fighting spirit to win. This region has proven to be very resilient to all sorts of challenges, political, economic challenges, and they still continue to fight, fight, fight to make it better. I think this fighting attitude, along with the natural resources that back it up, is an admirable characteristic of the region that's going to continue well into the future, and I think it's a great place to start thinking about how you turn that region around. I'll also tell you, I believe there are important winds of change structurally, especially in the core countries when it comes to governmental policies. Changes that will mean a more favorable climate for investment and a more sustained economic development based on productivity and jobs, not on continued reliance of huge social programs. Because of this, and yes, these countries are still struggling today, but their economies should be much better positioned to shift from a commodity-based economy to one where services and consumer consumption is a much more important part. Now, interestingly enough, it's also becoming more economically advantageous to invest in manufacturing in Latin America, particularly relative to China, as the wage rate gap continues to narrow. So when you factor this in with what we all hope is more changes, positive changes in government and social policies, you can begin to see this is a recipe for success around the corner for Latin America. So all these things couldn't be happening at a better time. So let me close by saying this one more time. We really need to understand the lessons learned from the past to be able to anticipate what to do in the future. For me, the most important lesson is this. Those who are mindful of the long-term potential of Latin America and the region, and who were good stewards of their brands and their assets, were rewarded with great success in the 2000 era. So I want you to think about, if you're in Latin America, if you're in, you need to be in. You need to be patient, and you need to be deliberate with what you're doing. But if you're out, stay out. But be prepared to re-enter by over-investing and having a strategy to relaunch your business in that country. There is no halfway point between those two. Now, I'll also tell you one strategy is not superior to the other. To determine whether the strategy is right for your business, it's really dependent on the industry and your business's position within the industry. But that, to me, is the number one lesson that I've taken away from my years of experience in Latin America. So I believe in 10 years, Latin America is going to look very different, both politically and economically, than it does today. Yes, I know there are similarities to how Latin America looks today versus how it did 15 years ago, but I truly believe the region is going to evolve and position itself for even more success in the future. Because if you look at the basics, the infrastructure is there, the GDP per capita is going to come back, and you have a large growing middle class that wasn't there 15 years ago. And that means we should expect to see that middle class continue to grow, and it will grow faster than developed economies, so it's a great place to invest your business. And this middle class will gain more purchasing power and the ability to drive more consumption. It's because of this tremendous potential of the Latin American region that I believe it's going to continue to evolve, enabling Latin America to reach its economic potential. The potential that I know we all believe that it has and that it will deliver. Muchísimas gracias y obrigado.